Until I found this photo from Grandmere State Park. This is from Joshua Nowicki, and what you're seeing here is a mirage. We typically would not be able to see this from the Lake Michigan shore. We talked about this last night. Conditions are right on the lake that we're actually seeing a mirage of the Chicago skyline. Very interesting here. Here's what's happening. This is a good example of a superior mirage. So Joshua was on the Lake Michigan shore. He was looking towards the west, and Chicago's beyond the horizon. Should not be able to see it.
Hello, everybody. John the Morgile here, checking in for a new Flat Earth video for you. I hope you do enjoy it. The religion of scientism, not to be confused with Scientology, is a unique crypto-religion. There is no official headquarters for scientism's day-to-day operations. It doesn't even claim to be a religion, and its members don't realize that they are in fact members. In spite of all that, scientism is arguably the most popular religious belief system, hosting followers worldwide, penetrating all cross-sections of other religions and practically even all atheists. While Catholicism has the Vatican as its central operating layer, or similarly, Scientology has the so-called gold base in California, scientism doesn't exactly possess a similar central base of operations, but certainly holds profound sways over the hearts and minds of the majority of the population all the same. While the members of the institutionalized atheistic Church of Scientism don't actually realize they subscribe to any religious belief system, it requires faith in some rather absurd premises all the same. So what exactly is scientism? It involves the steadfast belief in fallacious concepts which appear to be the result of actual science, but are in fact quite the opposite. A perfect example of this is the fact that since a cellular phone operates by applying principles arrived at by applied science and can only function with the technical infrastructure that requires orbiting satellites in the sky. Therefore, the reasoning goes, since cell phones function, there must be satellites in the sky. Therefore, the world is a spinning ball and NASA isn't lying their asses off about flying around in space. The fact that cell phones indeed operate does not actually equate to proof positive in satellites in space orbiting the Earth or Earth's spinning sphericity. But if we show the world to be flat and stationary, which means by direct implication that NASA is in fact lying their asses off and satellites as we know them simply couldn't possibly exist. Of course, the religion of scientism wholeheartedly believes in satellites flying around in space, and their main piece of evidence? Well, they believe that cellular phones and GPS tracking exclusively rely upon satellites flying around in space to operate. Therefore, since our phones work and GPS works, the Earth is thusly a spinning ball. The truth is, arrays of high-altitude weather balloon networks could achieve the same ends claimed to be met by satellites for just a fraction of the cost using technologies which have been available since at least the early 1940s, at least. If you examine the claims made by the likes of NASA in terms of the distance which satellites must send and receive radio transmissions using hardly any power source to speak of, it becomes obvious that they simply couldn't work even if you could get them up there in orbit, which isn't possible anyway, but an array of high-altitude communications balloons could certainly support modern GPS and the connectivity needs, making satellites unnecessary, even if such RF shots were possible, which they're not. Another example of the faith instilled into the population by scientism is the idea that certain beliefs are required to be considered scientific. So, like if a person doesn't believe that the sun is 93 million miles away, they are somehow no longer credible without bothering to ask how they've arrived outside of the standard set of beliefs. The sad part about this is I know full well that people hate me for talking about what we're going to get into during this video today. People whom I would otherwise get along with perfectly well will literally hate my guts and also consider me as being intellectually inferior and psychologically damaged for even considering such things, let alone questioning or, dare we say, debunking certain whirling oblate pillars of the status quo. In truth, I pray that such people are able to re-examine their long-held belief systems and related paradigm, even if only for argument's sake, and simply ask some very important questions to skeptically re-examine certain axioms which they hold dearly and often don't even realize it. So like many people fully believe they live, stuck to the side of a spinning ball in space, flying around multiple orbital paths beyond the realm of our capacity to fully grasp, but they couldn't tell you even approximately how fast they believe they're spinning and orbiting through space. If the truth is at all important to you, the viewer, then hopefully you can agree that asking questions and humoring new ideas can't hurt you. At worst, it will turn out that you continue believing what you have always believed, and all you've wasted is perhaps a bit of time confirming and solidifying what you already believe to be true. On the other hand, if it actually turns out that some of the things which you believe to be true for your entire life have been founded upon fallacies, misunderstandings, and even lies, then wouldn't you want to know the truth? This is why re-examining our belief system and asking sometimes painful or controversial questions is so very important, especially during our era, where we have unique advantages in our ability to gather information, share information. However, the system is stacked against us with so much deception foisted upon us systematically starting at a very young age. Many of us understand, or at least have always felt, something is off, something is wrong with the world at large, but can't quite put our finger on it. We find signatures and traces of deception all the time, whether it's in the political system or the legal system, religions or the educational system, the for-profit medical industry, the Federal Reserve scam, or like the poisoning of our very water using fluoride to, blanket medicate everyone with neurotoxin for the stated purpose of potentially whiter teeth, and on and on and on. I mean, there's lots of examples of how the world is in a bad state, right? It is so very important to highlight the distinction between things we know and can prove versus things which we believe and maybe can make a case for based on our interpretation of the often circumstantial evidence. When it comes to spiritual beliefs or like the paranormal or the supernatural, there is rarely physical evidence which one can study or tangibly examine or reference. In this sense, some degree of faith is necessary along with the foundation of healthy skepticism in order to delve into the realm of the supernatural based on circumstantial abstract evidence. On the other hand, the physical world which we live in provides us with more than enough physical evidence to point to when making the case for observable, quantifiable reality. So there's a distinction in the things that we know and things we believe. Our understanding of physical reality relies upon unambiguous, definite applications of science like geometry and applied practical physics. As a result of practical applications of geometry or physics, we can expect tangible, definite physical evidence. Such realms of study provide us with cogent, calculated answers, leaving little room for interpretation or personal subjective belief systems to sway the end result. Geometry and physics, for two examples, require no faith to operate successfully and finally. For example, if you're examining a billiards table along with its accompanying sequential ceramic spheres, There's no question in anyone's mind that the pooled balls are spherical objects with a measurable radius just under 2 inches, and the pool table's surface is a level planar surface, and under normal operations is totally stationary. There is no room for debate in these statements, no abstract explanation or interpretation necessary on the part of the observer. Indeed, pretty much everyone with their mental faculties about them can agree upon these premises. A pool table is a stationary plane, and the billiards balls are spheres which sometimes move around the table. Plain and simple. No faith required to get on board with these demonstrable facts. So, I don't believe that pool tables are static planes and pool balls are spherical. We know it. We all understand these two principles unambiguously and uncontestably. If someone tried to convince me, and hopefully you, the viewer, that pool balls are not spheres and pool tables are not level planes, they would have a very difficult time trying to do so, and such a thing is frankly impossible. No line of reasoning could ever result in any rational person ever changing their mind about these two little facts. Such is the nature of objective reality. Beneath the surface, however, reality appears to contain other concepts which are not so easily measured or quantified. Subconscious elements of our personal experience of reality are more abstract, incorporeal, or less easily quantified, harder to define. While we rely upon our senses and our innate God-given power of reasoning and logic, enhanced by the advanced applications of modern technology, in order to orient ourselves within the realm of reality, underlying the foundation of our wider worldview. Let's make a conscious effort to differentiate between objective facts, which can be documented, demonstrated, and repeated, versus subjective opinions, perhaps supported by some tangible circumstantial evidence, but beliefs and opinions nonetheless. In any case, the religion of scientism forces its unwitting members to put their faith in a misguided and erroneous concept of science with a capital S, which is quite the opposite of the actual essence of science. Science is supposed to be a systematic and logical way of thinking, a process to discern the truth, holding no attachments to concepts which are not supported by the evidence. When an observer becomes emotionally attached to a worldview or a belief system which is not supported by observable evidence, or is shown to be fallacious, a natural psychological reaction invokes cognitive dissonance as a defense mechanism, especially when dealing with emotionally reinforced concepts that were installed into the entire culture's core belief system at a young age. Beliefs that we've held since our very formative years are far more difficult to change or even skeptically to question since we've held them for so long. The fact that we were all pretty damn gullible when we were little kids doesn't help that situation, for we can be convinced of pretty much anything, no matter how absurd, when we're little, and yet we tend to hold on to those beliefs for the rest of our lives. Many of us were convinced of Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny during this phase in our lives, wherein the trusted adults and even the authoritative institutions actively lied to convince us of these fallacies. Luckily, they also cut us loose from the Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny phenomenon before we were full-blown adults, right? When a young child attending elementary school level science classes is first told that the world is a spinning sphere, rotating around its axis at 1,000 miles an hour while orbiting the sun at over 66,000 miles an hour, during the rare cases when the child becomes incredulous, responding to the teacher that they don't believe that the world is a spinning ball since we don't feel any of these hypersonic geological speeds, and you certainly would feel it if we were orbiting and spinning around orbital trajectories, the teacher will respond with something along the lines of,
"Well, we don't feel any geological motion since there's no acceleration involved, and we would only be able to detect acceleration with our innate senses. When you're traveling down the highway at 70 miles an hour, it doesn't feel like you're going very fast at all. In fact, it feels like you're standing still, sans any potholes or turns in the road, as we can only detect acceleration."
It is impossible for such a child to argue with the teacher in these rare instances, since the point the teacher made is indeed believed by the teacher, and it seems valid. Plus, all the textbooks seem to agree that the Earth is rotating on its axis at 1,000 miles an hour near the equator, orbiting the sun at over 66,000 miles an hour. And, it does sort of feel like you're standing still in the car, even when you're going down the highway at 70 miles an hour. Shit. So this must all be true, like the teacher said. We really are stuck to the side of a spinning ball flying around the infinite vacuum of space. The truth is, it never occurred to us culturally to actually test the claims made by the institutions of authority in our world. Our educational system would more aptly be called an indoctrination system or a mind control program, wherein students are not taught how to think critically or skeptically examine information. No, quite the contrary. They're taught to memorize information dictated by the state and later on recall or regurgitate that information that was memorized. Even in typical science classes, the student is not given practical experience in the scientific method. Perhaps they learn what the scientific method is by definition, but very seldom will you find instances where they practically apply the actual scientific method during science class. Arguably, the most ironic thing about this whole phenomenon is the fact that the spirit of science is to question everything, especially long-standing, widely held belief systems. Science references data and should not be emotionally attached to one model over another, other than what is supported by the data. Actual science welcomes and even inherently entails introspection or skeptical examination. Projections and models can only improve by being scrutinized and revised. Without constant introspection and the flexibility to change, our understanding of the world becomes stagnant, and any errors therein become more deeply rooted and ingrained into our overall belief system or worldview. If a person is unable to modify their worldview as new evidence is considered, they cease to be scientific and become quasi-religious. If we fail to question our belief systems, or if we rely upon faith in books or faith in men like Einstein or Neil deGrasse Tyson, in lieu of trusting our own God-given senses, then sciencing we are not. Science is a process to accurately understand the world, not a set of beliefs or a body of information. Sure, it entails a body of information. However, many people will admit they have formed their worldview based on quote-unquote science when they can't necessarily define, explain, or even understand the science they are pointing to as the basis of their worldview. With all that being said, the concept of a flat and motionless world is unquestionably within the realm of objective reality. Unambiguous, easily proven by physics and geometry, with practical evidence of its validity which anyone can observe and repeat all over the damn place. This statement often comes as a shock to people who are new to the topic. Simply mentioning flat Earth evokes notions of conspiracy theories and webs of color-coded strings thumbtacked to various clippings, articles, and images on a corkboard deep within a poorly lit, smoke-filled basement. But alas, the proofs of concept of flat Earth can be physically measured, quantified, and defined with no need for belief of some convoluted theories, institutions, or astronauts. No faith in far-out concepts required, although the ultimate realization of this truth can surely lead to some rather far-out concepts, but we won't get into all that right now.
What is gravity?
You have no idea. Okay, next question.
What is gravity?
You have no idea. Okay, next question.
What is gravity?
You have no idea. You have no idea. Okay, next question.
This is called gravity. That's what I do. I'm Neil deGrasse Tyson, bitch. That's what I do. I'm Neil deGrasse Tyson, bitch. That's what I do. I'm Neil deGrasse Tyson, bitch.
What is gravity?
We have no idea. Okay, next question.
This is called gravity.
We can describe gravity. We can say what it does to other things.
This is called gravity.
Today we're just going to keep it simple and go through some of the fundamentals of the actual science which disagrees with scientism and supports flat Earth. So getting right onto it, it's important for us to establish exactly what the dimensions and physical properties of the spinning ball Earth are supposed to be. Now, these are not my claims, but the official standard scientific dimensions of the spinning ball Earth, in theory. If you were to poll 100 people who believe in the spinning ball Earth and have never been exposed to the flat Earth movement, at least 99 of them will have just absolutely no idea what the approximate physical properties of the spinning ball Earth are supposed to be. Surely they believe in the spinning ball and probably learned about its size and velocity at some point in like elementary school or maybe like high school, but off the top of their head, most people have no clue what the numbers are supposed to be in terms of the size or the velocity of the world, just for starters. You know, had you asked me 10 years ago, I too would have been among the 99, for such information is never applied to any aspect of our lives, even up to the point of architecture and engineering. Students and practicing architects, practicing engineers do not use numbers in terms of the curvature of the Earth or the velocity of orbit or rotation. None of that stuff comes into play for architects or engineers, just to name a couple. This is an extremely important point, for it goes to show that practically everyone can subscribe to a belief system without actually understanding exactly what it is that they believe. So let's just quickly run through some of the alleged physical attributes of the spinning ball Earth. In terms of the geometry of the thing, the world is claimed to be an oblate spheroid with a spherical radius of just under 4,000 miles. The circumference of the globe around the equator is allegedly just shy of 25,000 miles. They claim the sun is over 93 million miles away and the moon is 238,000 miles away. Yet by sheer coincidence, both the sun and the moon appear to be approximately the same size in the sky because the sun is 400 times larger, but also 400 times more distant than the moon. A cosmic lottery win that makes Powerball jackpot look like a game of craps. As for the geological motion, it's claimed that the ball Earth rotates upon a fixed axis at just over 1,000 miles an hour at the equator, with a gradually decreasing rotational velocity as distance from the equator is increased, down to the point of 0 at the exact location of the axis. This is very important to keep in mind, as there is supposedly a gradient, a major change in observers' rate of rotation around the globe depending on their latitude. So like if you're standing at the equator, you're supposedly zipping along the curve of the Earth at 1,000 miles an hour, but if you're standing farther north, say somewhere in Canada, you may only be spinning around the face of the Earth at a few hundred miles an hour. This variable in velocity is, of course, due to the radius of the Earth being at its highest at the equator, meaning an observer at the equator is traveling along a much larger arc than an observer near the pole. It's not like there's any physical evidence to support this variable speed of rotation. It's simply demanded by the geometry of a spinning ball. Any spherical object spinning upon a fixed axis will necessarily see objects near the axis traveling more slowly than objects further from the axis of rotation, while the rotations per minute are the same. So if an observer is standing at the equator, they are supposedly traveling along the curved globe faster than the speed of sound, while another observer standing near to the North Pole is traveling about half the speed as the hour hand on a clock, discernibly not spinning at all. Anyone who's been lucky enough to travel to both the equator and to near the North Pole will attest to the fact that there is no discernible difference between these two areas in terms of rotational velocity. At the same time, the conventional scientific narrative claims that the world is also orbiting the sun at 18.5 miles per second, which comes out to 666 miles an hour around the ecliptic plane relative to the sun, which is also supposedly traveling at a 60-degree angle to the ecliptic plane at almost 500,000 miles an hour. These two velocities, the Earth's alleged orbital velocity and the sun's orbit around the alleged galactic center, are so much faster than anything we can relate to in our day-to-day lives, it is impossible to comprehend just how fast this actually is. Beyond that, they also claim the galaxy is traveling through space at many millions of miles per hour, and yet another conflicting direction misaligned to the ecliptic plane. It's important to mention that these orbital velocities are not my claims. These are not my numbers. These are claims made by the giants of science and parroted by every textbook and science-related documentary that you can find. At any rate, these incomprehensible, totally ludicrous speeds are not linear paths of motion, but are instead supposed to be curvilinear trajectories, which are all misaligned to one another and uncoordinated with each other. So now that we've quickly reviewed the official numbers in terms of the world's size, shape, and velocity, let's just test some of the claims entailed within the dogmas of scientism. So first, we don't notice the motion of the Earth because we only notice acceleration and not constant velocity, just like the car going down the freeway as mentioned by the teacher. This premise is true. We can easily detect acceleration or changes in speed, however, not necessarily a constant velocity along a straight line path, especially if we are fixed to that frame of reference. Of course, there are some very important differences between a rectilinear straight line path and a curvilinear trajectory of travel in terms of certain immutable laws of physics, specifically inertia and centrifugal force. The problem here is that the spinning ball Earth orbiting around the sun should be anything but a consistent velocity or a fixed frame of reference, free of any and all physical indicators of both angular acceleration as well as acceleration in terms of speed or velocity. For one thing, the globe Earth is supposedly traveling around multiple great elliptical trajectory paths, not a singular straight line rectilinear path, as suggested by the typical analogy invoked by globetards the world over. The analog involving the car going straight down the highway at 70 miles an hour cannot adequately apply as an excuse for the Earth indeed behaving as a fixed frame of reference, lacking any and all physical signatures of curvilinear motion at variable speeds along multiple varied oblong paths of travel. The problems of orbit are compounded by the fact that they claim the world is also spinning on that polar axis once per 24-hour period. This means that an observer hypothetically stuck to the side of the spinning ball near the equator would be changing their directional orientation relative to the path of travel 180 degrees every 12 hours. So in the morning at sunrise, the observer should be standing on the nose of the speeding bullet Earth, and 12 hours later, that same observer who stood perfectly still the whole day should be standing on the tail end of the speeding bullet Earth. So every day when you wake up at sunrise, remember that the spinning ball Earth is racing up towards the soles of your feet at 666 miles an hour, but at night when the sun is setting, the spinning ball Earth is now traveling down and away from the soles of your feet at 666 miles an hour, a total acceleration of your direction of travel relative to the primary object in this relationship, the spinning ball Earth, of over 130,000 miles an hour. Furthermore, during certain times of year, the planet Earth should be experiencing a constant inertial phase shift between alleged orbital aphelion and perihelion, which are the sharper turns of the hypothetical orbital cycle. This means that the very heliocentric standard model demands acceleration in orbital velocity plus angular acceleration simply by adhering to the rotational and orbital cycles carved in stone by Team Globetard as part of their religious canon. Even if our orbital trajectory was claimed to be perfectly circular, which it is not claimed to be, That is simply not a straight line path, which is described in the whole car down the highway analogy. So if you're in a car going 70 miles an hour down the freeway along a curve, then your body reacts to this centrifugal force by leaning in the opposite direction as the turn, due to the immutable laws of inertia, which all known physical objects must adhere to whenever operating within physical reality. So if your car is traveling to the left along a perfectly circular track, your body will apparently lean towards the right for the entire time. Were you to vary your speed around the track or vary the radius of the curve, these variables would directly affect the amount of centrifugal force generated, thus varying the degree to which your body will lean. Furthermore, if that same perfectly circular track is replaced with an elliptical track, your body will necessarily increase leaning during the sharper portions of the curve and decrease leaning during the less sharp portions. This variable amount of leaning we're describing here can be more eloquently defined as a phase shift in your inertial reference frame relative to the primary body in the inertial relationship. That primary body being the car and not your body, which is the lesser body in this inertial relationship. Finally, to take the original globe-tarded analogy to its most absurd yet accurate ends within the confines of the bandwidth of this analog, suppose that the car traveling around the oblong racetrack is also spinning around on its axis like doing a constant barrel roll. If such a thing were possible, then try to make the claim with a straight face that the driver in that car wouldn't notice such twisted metal acrobatics because
you're inside the car, and it would be just like traveling straight down the highway at a constant 70 miles an hour without hitting any bumps.
The point is, this is exactly what capital S scientism claims is going on with the spinning ball Earth. That is, spinning around on its axis, going along a curved linear path. Clearly, however, what this all amounts to is definite, inherent, varying acceleration events built into the framework of the hypothetical globe-Earth heliocentric model. So, while the argument that we would easily notice geological motion if only there were some type of acceleration to register on our various high-tech instruments, not to mention our God-given senses, that argument might work on toddlers or elementary school students. It will certainly not work on rational adults who are actually questioning this concept with a skeptical, objective eye. It is self-evident that the world is at rest. All physical evidence one can hope to point to supports this claim. The concept that our world is spinning on its axis whilst traversing multiple orbital planes in conflicting and misaligned paths and velocities falls by the wayside with every bit of evidence examined rationally and skeptically, free of any preconceived notions about the world or the extended universe, which happen to have been installed into our paradigm during our very formative years while we were prone to believing in things like the Easter Bunny or the Tooth Fairy. The multimedia onslaught of Ball Earth infinite space propaganda is by far the most insidious and relentless psychological attack upon the toddlers of many a generation. Not only is the spinning ball Earth religion taught in all schools as an unassailable axiom, but the mass media machine has been cranking out predictive programming of the infinite space variety tirelessly since long before any sort of space programs even claimed to be underway. Indeed, the mass media was pushing the era of the 1940s and 1950s as the so-called space age. And then after that, we got aeronautics programs like NASA or Roscosmos, along with their Hegelian tactics like Sputnik. Another extremely compelling piece of verifiable evidence which supports the claim that the world is at rest is the fact that the duration of airline flights traveling from east to west often match the duration of their return flight, which is simply not possible upon the spinning ball Earth, where the destination points are supposedly traveling at supersonic velocities towards the east. So if you book a flight from, say, Florida to Texas, if you think about it, you would expect to see the flight leaving Florida to Texas to be relatively short compared to the return flight. To more easily grasp what I'm saying, picture you and a friend standing on opposite ends of a football field, facing one another from either end zone. Now, if you both start walking towards one another, you'll expect to meet up somewhere around the 50-yard line. Then, if you start over at opposite ends and begin walking towards the center as before, but your friend turns around and starts Forrest Gumping it away from the field towards the locker room, you would have a difficult time catching up with your friend, and you would certainly never expect to meet up anywhere near the 50-yard line. This is one of those immutable laws of reality which cannot be avoided by any physical objects operating therein. Two distant objects traveling towards one another will meet up in the middle every single time without fail. The same two distant objects racing against one another, traveling in a similar direction, will simply not behave in such a manner, no matter how many times you tried such an exercise. And yet, if you apply this same basic natural law to the flights between Florida and Texas and back, we find just a huge gaping problem with the ball Earth theory. The spin of the Earth should be doing half of the work for the flight to Texas, if not more than half really. This should be a very short flight indeed, as the plane travels towards Texas, and Texas also races towards the plane. On the other hand, if you've got the same plane taking off from Texas heading back towards Florida, this flight would have to catch up with Florida, which is constantly racing away from the plane, certainly making the effort far more difficult for this eastbound flight because it would not enjoy the luxury of Florida racing towards the nose of the plane as Texas would have been for the original flight. The fact of the matter is, these two flights are consistently, practically identical in terms of duration. Sometimes the flight racing against Forrest Gump, or the flight back to Florida from Texas, is actually shorter in duration than the original flight. This is totally non sequitur and simply doesn't jive with the doctrine of globetardia, which demands the world be spinning towards the east at over 700 miles per hour, conservatively, at the latitude in question here, between Florida and Texas. Most commercial planes routinely travel 500 miles an hour during flights of this nature. Team Globetard will of course provide heated and snarling rebuttals to apologize for the globe's failure to adhere to reality, usually by claiming that I don't understand the theoretical physics designed to officially apologize for these stark and obvious problems with the ball. They'll argue fantastical nonsense like,
well, since the atmosphere is always synchronized in lockstep with the rotational velocity of the Earth at that latitude, the airplane is thus velcroed to the Earth's rotational velocity by way of the atmosphere.
While they might not word it exactly like that, I promise you, this is essentially the globe-tarded argument against the problem with the airline flight durations not adhering to the doctrines of scientism involving geological axial rotation. While this argument entailing the synchronized atmosphere might actually seem to logically refute the point at hand, there are some major problems with the logic, naturally, right down the line. For one thing, the atmosphere is not velcroed to the ground below it. The atmosphere is comprised of unbonded gases which are in no way connected to the ground. Furthermore, even if the atmosphere was somehow bonded and synchronized with the ground beneath it, the airplane flying through the air at hundreds of miles an hour is certainly not bound to some hypothetical synchronization with the atmosphere. Such a claim is absurd, quite honestly. Commercial jetliners are designed to be aerodynamic, which specifically means they reduce drag or air resistance and rely on very powerful jet engines to slice through the air with ease, through headwinds, tailwinds, and crosswinds. Jetliners are extremely powerful machines which, if they were hypothetically synchronized with the alleged and hypothetical rotational reference frame of the ground prior to takeoff, as soon as the plane indeed takes off and begins accelerating independently of the Earth, and also accelerating independently of the ambient atmosphere, any adherence to the Earth's reference frame the plane once had is gone. Indeed, one of Newton's first laws of motion is the valid and cogent rule that an object at rest will tend to remain at rest until enacted upon by some other force, An object in rectilinear motion will tend to maintain its momentum until and unless enacted upon by some other force. Surely, we can consider the multiple giant jet engines attached to the wings of the plane as some other force. However, Team Globetard would have us believe that the Earth is spinning at 700 miles an hour to the east at the latitude given during this hypothetical flight. Above that, the atmosphere is synchronized in lockstep to the ground beneath it by some unknown, undescribed, and unproven mechanism. Within that spooky and unobservable connection, the atmosphere is somehow being bonded to the world below. The airplane is also bonded to the atmosphere, synchronized in lockstep with unbonded air around it, in spite of the fact that the airplane is powerfully self-propelled and intelligently controlled through the air using an aerodynamic shape to slice through the air with little resistance. Well, except for the wing area, which relies on specific differentials of airflow above the wing versus below the wing in order to provide lift proportionally with airspeed. So we're expected to believe that when the airplane takes off from Florida heading to Texas, the plane is spinning at 700 miles per hour towards the east with the Earth before takeoff. Then after it takes off, the plane remains locked within that frame of reference indefinitely, regardless of how much it accelerates towards the west. Secondly, the synchronized ground, atmosphere, and jet illogical apologetics does not absolve the fact that the plane and its eastward destination are forced to operate within this inconvenient realm called reality. Thus, they must adhere to the aforementioned immutable natural laws. All objects traveling towards one another will eventually meet somewhere in the middle, every single time, remember? The unshakable position held by Team Globetard in this argument proves conclusively that they do not fully grasp the problem here, and they're not doing so on accident, nor are they doing so consciously or on purpose. This illogical and confusing behavior results from their inability to see how simple it is, as they are operating within a belief system that assumes the Earth is a spinning ball no matter what evidence is presented to them. You see, they're basically saying that the flight from Texas to Florida is being pulled along with the atmosphere as it is traveling east with the spin of the Earth at over 700 miles an hour. Plus, the plane is also going another, say, 500 miles an hour above and beyond that in order to catch up with Florida and travel at ground speed of about 500 miles an hour. Then, on the other hand, the flight from Florida to Texas, the first flight, is thus necessarily fighting against 700 miles per hour atmosphere, which is locked in with the ground below, and therefore can only manage to maintain ground speeds of about 500 miles per hour, even though Texas is supposedly racing towards the plane at over 700 miles an hour. So really, the plane is like flying backwards at 200 miles an hour when traveling from Florida to Texas in order to assure that the two flight durations are even similar, let alone practically identical in their ground speed velocities and practically identical in their duration. So essentially, they're claiming that the plane flying west to Texas is actually flying backwards at 200 miles an hour, while Texas is essentially racing towards the plane at 700 miles an hour, making the relative ground speed between the plane and Texas as about 500 miles an hour in order for the flight duration to remain consistent with the return flight. This mental gymnastics starts to annoy or confound even the most stout and focused minds considering the conundrum. They are intentionally overcomplicating something which is really quite simple, not just for the perceived benefit of confusing the hell out of everyone involved in the process, but more because they are, as usual, operating from the position that the Earth must necessarily be a spinning ball no matter what, so wild narratives lacking any substance, evidence, or demonstrability are spun from the fallacious and impossible starting point that the world is a spinning ball no matter what, and ending with the natural observation that the two flight durations are similar in reality. Again, the atmosphere is not velcroed to the ground below, and I challenge anyone to provide evidence that it is. The atmos plane is comprised of unbonded gases which have no direct connection to the ground below them. There are tons of examples of variable altitude clouds seen traveling in opposite directions at the same time, completely destroying any notion that these unbonded gases above are somehow synchronized in lockstep with the ground below. Furthermore, this ridiculous stance would demand that all westbound flights experience a 700 mile per hour headwind as a rule, and all eastbound flights would enjoy a 700 mile per hour tailwind as a rule. This is frankly absurd, and no such thing has ever been observed, nor will such a phenomenon ever be documented, as the world is quite simply at rest, and the atmos plane above travels freely and independently of the ground below, while planes in the atmosphere flying around travel freely and independently of the ground and freely and independently of the air. Sure, winds aloft do play a role in ground speed and airspeed, but not to this degree. Let's apply the football field analogy and really max out this analog for all we can milk it. So what they're saying is, what Team Globetard is saying, if we do the football field exercise again, and while you're heading towards Forrest Gump as he runs away from you, you have a wind at your back, which is, say, a generous 20 miles an hour. Would you then somehow expect to meet up with Gump near the 50-yard line, just as you did when you were both walking towards one another? Of course, nobody would expect to see such results due to the tailwind. However, that's exactly what's expected to occur during the flight from Florida to Texas and back. Since Team Globetard is operating under the preconceived notion that the Earth's motion must exist, and so it thus becomes necessary to frantically grasp at straws and piece together an apologetic narrative which allows for the data involving the two flight durations to work. We would remember that science does not entail espousing belief systems which are apart from the data and somehow immune to skeptically testing the beliefs against the data, since it is science. If we launch our so-called scientific ventures from an unproven and ultimately false position that the world is a spinning ball flying through space, then put on blinders to any dissenting data and proceed crafting an apologetic narrative to account for the fact that the two flights are often similar in duration. That isn't science. The world is rather simply and self-evidently at rest, lacking any and all axial rotation or orbital motion. These are not unsubstantiated far-out claims. These are facts, which anyone who cares to skeptically and honestly revisit their long-held belief in the spinning ball Earth can verify. And the lack of curvature is the same sort of a story as the lack of motion. If a person, for some reason, decides to test the ball Earth theory, a good place to start is the practice and application of basic geometry. Where's the curvature? Where? Since we can all agree, much like the pool table analogy illustrated in the first part of this video, that all spheres have curvature, then if the world is actually a sphere, as they claimed, then we should be able to find physical, tangible curvature of the Earth's surface. It's not a very tall order. Even better than dry land, which is prone to the hills, valleys, mountains, and other obstructions, a large body of water provides a much better surface to measure whether or not the world possesses the necessary curvature to result in an overall sphere. Since we are much smaller than the world itself and don't have the luxury of a direct inspection, as we do with the billiards ball, it's a little more difficult to determine exactly how much curvature exists upon the surface of large bodies of water. At first, the globetards will try to make this appear as if it's an open and shut case for the globe.
Remember, we can see the mass of ships disappearing over the horizon after the hull has vanished, due to the ship traveling over a great convexity. There's your curvature, bada bang, bada boom, and the Earth is thus proven a sphere. End of story.
The ironic thing here is the fact that many globe Earth believers will go to this argument as a hopeful gotcha point, which is supposed to stump the flat Earth proponent, as if we've never heard this argument about the masts of ships disappearing before. The reason this is so ironic is, of course, that it shows that they believe that everyone in the Flat Earth movement had never heard of, let alone considered, this well-known cliche, which is taught to all generations of primary schools and toddlers as a mandatory curriculum for many decades past. Dude, everyone has heard about the claim that ships go over the curvature, mass lasts, and therefore the water is convex and thus the Earth is obviously a globe. We've all heard that. This is one of the very first items any mildly diligent ball Earth skeptic will review, for it is so ubiquitous within the annals of globe Earth lore, it's definitely inescapable, even for those without any particular interest in the flat Earth or globe Earth debate. We've all heard it, and it's been debunked for literally over 150 years since Zetetic Astronomy was published at the latest. We're given very specific proofs of the ball Earth's rotundity by historical Team Globetard in that these naval observations are exclusive to a ball Earth, and the curvature we're begging to see proof of is demonstrated by the vessels traversing across what amounts to a great convexity over the water. What is actually occurring when a distant seafaring vessel travels away from the observer beyond the horizon and then begins vanishing bottom first is perfectly and logically explained upon the planar surface of the Earth due to a couple things. First, the subjective laws of perspective, also the undulation of the surface of the waters, and atmospheric refraction. One way to check whether or not a ship is traveling along a great curve is to watch its journey from a more orthographic view, rather than from the bon voyage perspective as the ship travels towards the horizon. So if you're sitting on the dock in the bay and watch a large ship travel from a position on the left side of the bay many miles across your view over the water to the other side of the bay, you would expect it to travel across some amount of convexity. But exactly how much convexity? This is something that is not found in any standard educational curriculum or textbooks or even higher level science classes in terms of practical attempts to define the expected amount of Earth curvature and then proceed to measure for it. So the actual amount of geological curvature expected over a given distance goes as follows. Assuming a ball Earth with the given dimensions by Team Globetard, we should expect to see 8 inches per mile squared in vertical descent due to geological curvature. 8 inches per mile squared. A very simple equation which comes with a few caveats and even a super easy hack for hip pocket estimations off the top of your head. Right, so the caveats, and a practical example to estimate the expected curvature and compare that with the actual amount of curvature shown in the data. Right, so if we're dealing with a tower that's say 150 feet tall and it's say 20 miles away, and you want to know how much the tower should vertically descend like the ship did, right, as it's traveling away from you, how much it should vertically descend along the curve of the Earth at that distance, here's how you would go about figuring it up. Since the distance of the tower is 20 miles, we can't just start by squaring the 20 miles just yet. We have to establish the distance to the horizon first in order to get accurate numbers that won't be contested by globetards. So if you're standing on this diagram at point A, with your toes barely touching the water, looking across the water level towards the 150-foot tall tower 20 miles away, the hypothetical vertical descent along the convexity before you wouldn't begin until after the hypothetical point where your line of sight begins diverging from the surface of the water. Again, this is all assuming that the Earth is a ball. So in order to accurately apply the equation of 8 inches per mile squared, only the miles beyond the hypothetical geometric horizon actually count towards the vertical descent of the expected convexity. Right, so assuming the ball Earth, the higher you go up in elevation, the further the expected horizon would be. So when your observation altitude becomes increasingly high, it becomes very important to subtract out the miles leading up to the horizon from the total miles. There's a relatively simple equation that one can use to calculate the expected distance to the horizon based on your altitude, assuming the ball Earth. However, as a rule of thumb, we'll just use 6-foot tall observer, and if you're standing 6 feet tall with your toes in the water, so you're 6 feet above the water level, an unobstructed view towards the horizon will place the horizon distance at about 3 miles, give or take. So for the example here, we must plug in 17 miles instead of 20. We got to subtract out those 3 miles to the horizon. So 17 miles to the equation of 8 inches times the mile squared, which will render the result in expected inches of vertical descent due to geological curvature. 17 squared is 289, multiplied by 8 inches is 2,312 inches. And then, to reduce that into feet, something a little bit easier to understand, we'll divide by 12, of course, resulting in 192.6 feet. This means that the vertical descent demanded by the ball Earth geometry would place the base of the tower 192 feet below the horizon line, and indeed the top of the 150-foot tall tower should be completely obscured by the horizon. For the tower in question is at 20 miles away, as seen by a 6-foot tall observer standing in the sand with their toes in the water, couldn't possibly see any portion whatsoever of such a tower 20 miles away. The top of the tower would be over 40 feet below the horizon line, according to the geometry, again, demanded by the ball Earth. Of course, we can point to numerous, probably infinite examples of instances where observers can spot distant towers or skyscrapers or mountains which should simply not be visible below the horizon in the distance, according to the doctrine of rotundity. But the two which I always use are the impressive Chicago skyline, as viewed from Grandmere State Park over 50 miles away across this large body of water, standing water no less, so there's not tidal bulge or as much undulation as tidal waters. It's important to mention that while using such orthographic diagrams is invaluable to describing the practical application of the numbers using an easily relatable vehicle, there are some areas where the diagram fails to reflect reality, and it can lead to pitfalls we should take care to avoid. So, the main thing is the total lack of the subjective laws of perspective, the lens through which all sentient beings, and scientists too, must observe the world through. So when you're looking at this orthographic sort of cross-section view of an observer standing on the beach, peering across the 20-mile body of water towards the tower, it completely fails to show that objects which gain distance from the observer will apparently diminish in angular size proportionally. This is why many blossoming ball Earth skeptics will ask the question, if the Earth is flat, then why can't we see, say, the Eiffel Tower from the east coast of the US, or why can't we see, like, Mount Fuji from England? To describe the problem they're pointing to, if you flesh out a diagram of the orthographic cross-section nature, it neatly illustrates the problem which might actually appear to support the ball Earth theory, but, as mentioned, it completely fails to account for the subjective operation of perspective, the lens through which all observers must view the world. So an accurate orthographic diagram of the Eiffel Tower should involve some allowance for the apparent diminishment of angular size as distance is gained from the tower. So the scale of a large object like the Eiffel Tower should decrease smaller and smaller with every mile that it gains from the observer. In light of this obvious information, it makes perfect sense why we cannot see the Eiffel Tower from the Florida coast.
Until I found this photo from Grandmere State Park. This is from Joshua Nowicki, and what you're seeing here is a mirage. We typically would not be able to see this from the Lake Michigan shore. We talked about this last night. Conditions are right on the lake that we're actually seeing a mirage of the Chicago skyline. Very interesting here. Here's what's happening. This is a good example of a superior mirage. So Joshua was on the Lake Michigan shore. He was looking towards the west, and Chicago's beyond the horizon. Should not be able to see it.
And let's quickly go over one more impossibly distant observation which demonstrates the world's complete and utter lack of convexity. This one comes with an amusing anecdote. So a few years ago, I spent a little time in county jail, and of course, I eventually made the case for flat Earth on more than a few rather tense occasions. One thing that really made an impression on me, for I wasn't expecting it, was the surprising logic which one dude exhibited during this otherwise less than logical exchange. So the point arose where I brought up this image, which is the image of the Pic de Fenestralius from Bar des Écrins, which is a whopping 270 miles away. When I mentioned this, again, we were in jail, a dude immediately called bullshit. I was surprised that he actually used some logic to support his position. Basically, he was like, there's no way anyone could see that far, and he wasn't referring to the fact that the curvature shouldn't allow for it. He missed that point altogether, but because of how the atmosphere becomes increasingly clouded and even opaque at long distances due to a cumulative effect of the particulates in the air, to the point where it behaves as an opaque obstruction to light over hundreds of miles for sure. So he was calling bullshit on me, stating that I was making this up to prove a point about curvature. This was a problem I hadn't anticipated because, once again, we were in jail at the time, so it's not like I could just pull up a web page on my cell phone or on my tablet and download the actual image that I'm referring to here. You see, dude actually has a valid point. Under normal circumstances, there's no way that you could hope to view something that's over 270 miles away due to the reflectivity and opacity of the atmosphere at such distances. On the other hand, this isn't just any normal observation or picture, but is instead a world record holder for long-distance landscape photography, for it was for several years running. It has since been replaced as the world's longest distance landscape photograph, but I still use it as an example because it's a beautiful shot, and I've also had a brief email exchange with the guy who took the picture. During most times of the day, it is indeed impossible to view this mountain range at this distance due to a whole host of conditions in the ambient atmosphere which prevent a clear line of sight. The guy who snapped this picture had to be very patient, and for one thing, only attempted the shot during the twilight hours when the position of the sun lended itself to the range of view from that vantage point. Also, had the air been much warmer or more humid, it would have prevented the photographer from seeing the distant mountain range. And of course, when you're at a higher elevation, you can see further through the atmosphere because the atmosphere is less dense of particulates at higher elevations. With no small measure of persistence and diligence, he was fortunate enough to make the attempt during the convergence of multiple key variables at just the right time. Thus, this picture of Pic de Fenestralius from Bar des Écrins then clinched the title of the world's furthest long-distance photograph from over 270 miles away. Of course, the observer here was far more than 6 feet over the water level. He took this picture from up on a mountain, which is one of the main reasons he could see as far as he did, since anyone standing near the ground could never dream of catching a glimpse of something over 270 miles in the distance. Anyways, if you do the math, as basically spherical trigonometry pertaining to this observation, factoring in for the observer's height and so on, you'll find that the peak of the mountain in question should be over a half a mile below the horizon line. The fact that we can clearly see the mountain here, and countless other examples which defy the doctrine of rotundity, we have satisfactorily debunked the claim that the surface of the Earth is a large convexity resulting in an overall sphere. In the same vein as Globers busting out oh-so-tired cliches as if they're going to surprise or stump someone who's been deeply engaged in this topic for several years, as if we'd never heard it. I think it's more a reflection of that person being very new to the topic, so we really need to treat them with respect and try to be patient, even though it's hard to do at times because they can be very insulting at first, and nobody was there to hold my hand through this. We must remember that we were all right in their position, more or less at some point in the past, and they are potentially on the path towards understanding the truth about the world if they can only apply their admirable, healthy, and long overdue skepticism towards their existing belief in a spinning ball Earth. Just remember how uncertain we all once were about this topic. Hell, even questioning the infinite space ball Earth hypothesis is a difficult point to get to because the concept of flat Earth is so bizarre, so far out from what we expect to be a huge deception, the very shape of the world. Most people don't even get to the point where they're making fun of flat earthers and trying to debunk the flat earth facts. So I'm grateful whenever the opportunity presents itself to reach someone new who's experiencing the first stages of this extremely deep and life-changing paradigm shift. We really have to try and give them some leeway when it comes to assuming we're stupid, illiterate, and crazy, as each person has the potential to wake up from the mind control devices native to the infinite space hypothesis and become a new flat earth proponent. The point I'm trying to make is that globe earthers don't know how to go about measuring the earth for curvature, as they don't know what the expected amount of curvature should be, how to go about measuring for it if they did know, nor are they very much inclined to go about testing the world for curvature if they were aware of the logistics involved with testing for it. The pathetic minority of globbers who do go out and measure the Earth for the expected curvature are instantly plucked out of the ranks of globetards and become, in a blinding flash, super retarded, science-denying pariahs of superstitious beliefs, a flat earther. In the beginning of this video, we mentioned satellites, which are claimed by the likes of NASA to provide the necessary infrastructure to support cellular phones, GPS, satellite dish TV, among other things. As a result, many a globber point to the fact that cellular phones and GPS indeed function, providing proof positive of satellites in space. This is done in an attempt to refute the claims made by flat earthers that satellites do not actually exist, never have existed, and could never possibly exist due to a whole host of natural, immutable, and inescapable laws of physics prohibiting them. Furthermore, were it hypothetically possible for satellites to exist, so if we humor the official narrative involving satellites for the sake of argument, they would have been obsolete from day one, since high-altitude weather balloons or communications balloons had been used for decades prior to the advent of alleged communication satellites orbiting the Earth to provide this necessary infrastructure in support of the extend and range of communications, radio triangulations methods used to provide GPS services, and everything else allegedly achieved by satellites, running the gambit from high-resolution images from above for applications like Google Maps to utility services like DishNet or DirecTV. So, while our initial conversation started as discussing the definite applications of geometry to show the lack of geological curvature and physics to show the lack of geological motion along multiple rotational and orbital trajectories, it has been forced into the realm of discussing satellites, which allegedly support our communications infrastructure. This is an important point. When faced with undeniable proof that the world is at rest, lacking any trace of sphericity, instead of actually considering how these issues are mortal wounds for the heliocentric belief system, many people will completely ignore the implications therein and proceed pointing to satellites and to observations of the heavenly luminaries to, quote-unquote, debunk the flat Earth.
NASA took a picture of the ball Earth back in the 1960s, so there's no reason in even measuring for curvature.
While there may not be a reason to measure for curvature in light of NASA's blue marble image, the fact remains that if we go ahead and seek evidence for the curvature anyways, such curvature simply doesn't exist. This means that NASA has been lying their asses off since the very time of their inception, which means we can't trust anything that they say on an institutional level. Now, this is not an attack on the personal friends or family members of any viewers out there who work for NASA. NASA employs a ton of people who are extremely smart and completely oblivious to the deception which they are in part indirectly perpetuating. In fact, it's safe to assume that the vast majority of NASA's payroll is completely unaware that NASA is totally corrupt and appears to be a supermassive money laundering operation which not only receives over $20 billion annually just from tax funding, but the amount of NASA's reported private donations and investments from individuals and businesses supposedly dwarfs that by many orders of magnitude. It is important to mention that essentially all astronauts who claim to have been to space were confirmed Freemasons, which in short means they cannot be trusted to tell the truth if they've been instructed to lie about fill-in-the-blank topic by their respective lodge. So, if you have an uncle who designed some element of, like, the toilet management system on the LISS, I'm not calling your uncle a liar, or a Freemason even. I'm saying that your uncle most certainly designed that toilet seat on the LISS, or whatever it is, and said custom space toilet was probably even manufactured by NASA themselves or subbed out to a private contractor tasked with producing the prototype. The payload may have even been loaded onto a rocket ship at Cape Canaveral and may have even been launched into the sky on the NASA rocket. The point is, that's where any spacebound object journey always ends, is just to the point where it's launched into the air on a rocket. The rockets which NASA, SpaceX, and other space agencies launch all have one thing in common. The rockets don't go into space. Instead, they are at best being launched along a great arc back down into the ocean, while the lying Freemasons sit on a soundstage bouncing around on wires, pretending to be in space, making total fools of the entire nation while they either piss away and or pocket billions of dollars annually pretending to be in space. The fact that we know the world is a static plane directly extends to the fact that NASA has necessarily been lying about the concept of infinite space housing an infinitude of terra firma spherical worlds in all directions. Why would they lie about this? Many people ask. In truth, at this point, it's not necessary for me to provide a motive for their deception, for the evidence of the deception itself is overwhelming, totally independent of showing exactly who is responsible and why they did it. There are several original videos on this channel here which delve into the topic. I'll try and remember to put some cards and links in the description for videos that examine the potential motives and extended implications of this great deception, which indeed fooled the entire world, even the very elect, for many generations up until now. Now, I pray that you, the viewer, and those close to you, be not deceived, for the devious and wicked spiritual forces and high seats of power of this world cannot affect you directly. They can only deceive and seduce you, cloud your ability to judge properly, and they've established autonomous systems of social pressures to reinforce the herd mentality surrounding the Ball Earth theory and scientism in general. The Ball Earth belief system is unique in the modern age, as it is fiercely defended by a flimsy shell of circumstantial evidence, defended by a homegrown, purposeful ignorance employed by the masses to guard themselves from inconvenient facts to the contrary. Just the other day, I was discussing flat Earth in the comments section of one of my videos, and dude mentioned,
The circular path of the moon over flat Earth is impossible, since we only ever see one face of the moon from the ground, therefore the Earth is a ball.
Which, according to his estimation, debunked the flat Earth nonsense as an open and shut case without any need for conversation or logical discussion. Of course, the path of the moon, or the fact that it only ever presents one face to us here on the ground, is claimed to contain exclusive proof of the spinning ball Earth. However, just as you probably expect, this is more of the same, illogical apologizing and frantically grasping at straws to find a way to force the preconceived, unassailable axiom that the world is a spinning sphere to retroactively jive with sticky and inconvenient nuances found by studying observable reality in spite of any contrary evidence galore. It's unsurprising that, in turn, Team Globetard evokes their faithful signature tactics, deploying hypothetical mental gymnastics, leaping headlong off the ledge of immutable natural laws, bouncing off the springboard of ad hominem attacks against the people on the opposite side of the argument, and the ultimate triple Lindy of hypothetical surrealism, theoretical astrophysics. So, when faced with the direct and measurable facts that the world is free of curvature and is also at rest, thus rendering it quite the contrary of a spinning sphere, many typical globe believers will then proceed in pointing to the moon as proof of their ever-fleeting and elusive globe Earth dreidel. This would be akin to attempting to determine the dimensions and overall nature of a pool table. You're explaining to a person that the pool table is a planar surface on the top. It really doesn't move. From an overhead perspective, it's rectangular in shape, 3 or 4 feet measuring, and then they interrupt you and say,
Wait a minute, that pool table couldn't be a planar surface because look at this number 8 ball. It's clearly a sphere, and it definitely moves around during the game of pool, so how could you possibly say that the table is a planar surface? I've measured thousands of billiards balls, snooker balls, cue balls, and they're all spheres. There's no reason to actually measure the pool table because we clearly can assume it. The pool table also is a sphere. Duh.
While this exaggerated example is obviously not meant to be taken seriously at face value, it is, however, a perfect parallel to what Team Globetard is actually doing when someone ignores the fact that curvature and motion have been disemboweled before their very eyes, and instead of letting that reality sink in, the reality being that the spinning ball Earth requires geological curvature and motion, meaning there is no such thing as a spinning ball Earth, instead of conceding that point and letting it sink in, they change the subject and start talking about observations of the moon, damn it, which, quite simply put, have absolutely no impact against the points raised involving geological curvature and motion. Certainly, we can and will go there when it comes to this person's claim about the moon, for it is something which occurred to me many years ago when first looking into Flat Earth, so we've got original content discussing this very thing. But the claim, again, is that since the moon only ever presents us with one face, and the visible side of the moon doesn't vary depending on your location relative to the moon's current position. In other words, their argument is that, humoring a flat Earth azimuthal equidistant projection, we would expect to see a variation in the visible portion of the moon depending on whether you're standing, say, north or south of the moon on a similar line of longitude. So, like, if the moon is very close, as necessitated by a flat Earth hypothesis, if two observers standing upon a similar line of longitude, one of them standing near the Tropic of Cancer and the other standing near the Tropic of Capricorn, they each see a virtually identical image of the moon. Granted, one will be upside down relative to the other one. This is supposed to have the effect of somehow reconvincing me, or anyone else who's actually familiar with this topic, reconvincing us that we somehow live, stuck to the side of a spinning ball in space again. Of course, that's never going to happen, because while it is admirable that this person is actually applying some degree of skeptical criticism towards the overall topic of Flat Earth, this is a far sight more than most typical globe Earth believers are doing. So the 2 or 3 people that were discussing this with me the other day, I want to at least commend you for seeking out this information and discussing it. However, there are some major problems with your logic here. For starters, you're assuming to know for certain all sorts of values which we really don't know concretely. For example, you're assuming that the moon is a spherical object. Plus, you seem to know the actual size and actual distance to the moon as well, in order to make any definite claims of what we would expect to see based on the geometry of the situation. So, like, if you have a basketball and write a sentence, a short sentence across it on one side, then, elevate that basketball up, say, 20 feet, yourself and a friend stand on opposite sides of the ball. As you face up to look at the beginning portion of the sentence, due to the geometry of the situation, you will not be able to see the end portion of the sentence. This would all be reversed from the vantage point of your friend on the opposite side. They would only be able to see the end portion of the sentence, but the beginning few letters would be obscured due to the geometry of the situation again. This is all a very brilliant setup, and it does go to show how this person is indeed thinking about Flat Earth, which is again commendable and heartwarming. The problem is, we don't actually know the exact dimensions and distance to the moon. We can make assumptions and educated guesses, but it is quite impossible to glean an accurate figure in terms of what is the moon, what is its actual size, shape, distance. Let me explain. While we certainly can easily apply the Pythagorean theorem to follow the footsteps of Eratosthenes and triangulate on the moon in order to glean a seemingly accurate estimate of its distance and size, the problems arise when we realize that atmospheric refraction, lensing, and other variables of high elevation objects being viewed from the ground will all act as variable perturbances in our ability to directly view the moon in order to attempt triangulation. A manifestation of this problem is easily illustrated by the fact that if 2 observers triangulate on the moon's elevation, angle, and azimuth, practically calculating the moon to be just shy of 4,000 miles up. Interestingly, the exact alleged radius of the ball Earth, hint, hint. But the problem is, if a third observer gets involved from another location at the same time, it will never line up to intersect the other two datum lines, which is what leads many people to believe that the Earth must be a ball. The problem with the moon being impossible to triangulate using the third datum line has nothing to do with Earth curvature, but instead the curvature of light itself through the medium of the atmosphere. It's called refraction. You see, it was long believed, allegedly by capital S science, that light always travels in straight line paths, and the concept of atmospheric refraction was only acknowledged by science starting in like the 1500s or thereabouts, according to capital H history. Now that we understand how drastically the apparent position of distant objects can vary depending on factors high above the ground like refraction, what this means is when you're looking up at the moon, what you're seeing is a subjective instance of the moon, a subjective instance of its apparent size and position, but it is not a perfect actual representation of the moon's actual size and position. I realize this probably sounds far more complex and convoluted than it needs to be, but follow me if you will. The layer of atmosphere directly surrounding all little observers on the ground is comprised of unbonded gases known as the troposphere. We can call it troposplane if we wish, same thing. As objects gain distance from the observer on the ground through the troposphere, they become less and less vibrant and more gray due to the fact that they are actually particulates and gases in the air, which on the macro level behave as a fluid and adhere to the laws of fluid and thermodynamics. While we cannot actually see the atmosphere on a clear day at close range, at a distance, however, the gases within the troposphere indeed glow a bright blue during sunlight, like a vibrant sapphire. During a bright clear day, the sky area is bright blue in all directions, showing that the gases in the troposphere indeed have some amount of substance and indeed cumulatively become less and less translucent with greater and greater distance gained from the observer. The gases in our atmosphere are thickest towards the ground and gradually decrease their density with altitude. So there is a density gradient of atmosphere above the ground, which is most thick and cumulative when standing at the lowest possible point, gazing parallel to the ground through the thickest portion of atmosphere, which extends in all directions parallel to the ground, practically infinitely. Since the density of the gases overhead gradually decreases and is limited in its vertical thickness, really it's like a thin blanket of atmosphere which gets less and less dense with altitude gained. So when you're looking straight up towards an overhead moon at its highest point in the sky, the amount of atmospheric refraction and lensing will be far less intense compared to the times when the moon is apparently closer to the horizon. The refraction index affecting the light from the moon is a variable value which will be about 0 when the moon is directly overhead, increasing its maximum refraction index when the moon is apparently closer to the ground. If the surface of the Earth didn't have any atmosphere, so like if we lived in a vacuum, then the apparent size and distance and behavior of the moon and other celestial lights would be far easier to observe, document, and discern in terms of triangulation. Since we do not actually live in a vacuum and light does not travel exclusively along straight line paths as once believed, then it becomes a major challenge to discern the exact proportions of objects like the moon. With that being said, the observable moon we see every night is essentially an apparent projection or a subjective representation of the actual size and distance of the moon. This claim is true whether the Earth happens to be a ball or a plane. As crazy as this sounds, we certainly cannot say one way or the other whether the moon is even a physical object at all, let alone definitely a sphere with a diameter of around 30 miles, sitting almost 4,000 miles in altitude, which are the approximate values gleaned by applying the Pythagorean theorem towards the moon using methods akin to those of Eratosthenes. Using these numbers would be an error, however, due to the fact that we have no way of knowing the extent of natural perturbances to the light, like atmospheric lensing, refraction, or magnetic refringence, and there's others. These things all skew our observations, leading to the numbers used in the equation to estimate the distance to the moon upon a planar surface. So in other words, you can use Eratosthenes' method and assume the Earth to be a ball and get one set of numbers valuing the moon's size and distance. And then you can use the same method assuming the Earth to be a plane and get a completely different set of resulting values. Both of these resulting values would be mathematically correct. However, both of them cannot be true at the same time. Furthermore, if we're unable to account for the exact amount of refraction and lensing involved, then neither one of them can be correct, really. At any rate, this sort of discussion is way too convoluted to carry through to its inevitable end, where I ultimately make the case that the claim involving the moon's circular path above and around the AE projection being debunked due to the fact that we don't see the necessary parallax depending on the viewpoint from either tropic doesn't hold water, since the original poster there was misguided in their understanding of where the burden of proof lies in the then current state of the discussion we were having. Once again, I just got done proving that the world lacks curvature and motion, then they pointed to the moon to try to debunk some element of the flat Earth model, which I have never espoused any model, by the way, so they're failing miserably at this whole debunking business, even worse than they're failing at this whole sciencing business. Since the burden of proof is now on the ball Earth side of the argument, you can't just change the subject and start pointing to the lights in the sky in order to try and dodge the extremely large hole in the globe Earth theory, which is, of course, the world's lack of curvature and rotational motion. Instead of rationally mitigating the damage done by logically showing some evidence for curvature or geological motion, they instead commence their misguided and ineffective debunking of some nuanced, inconsequential aspects of how the flat Earth model explains the cycles of the moon and our observations of the moon. This is classic cognitive dissonance, a la Globetard, wherein we consistently expect the globe Earth believers to ignore the obvious and fatal portions of an argument involving those two pesky physical aspects of a spinning ball, again, curvature and rotational motion. I implore those of you still on the fence about the globe or unsure about this topic to stop trying to debunk flat Earth without first understanding flat Earth. It would be far more productive for you to instead focus some of that healthy skepticism towards your long-held belief system involving the spinning ball Earth. To finish out the home stretch of this video, I'm going to quickly highlight some of the major problems with the ball Earth model, specifically pertaining to the moon, and how the spinning ball Earth theory miserably and fatally fails to adhere to observable reality. This is owing to the fact that the same poster who claimed that the moon over flat Earth doesn't work due to the lack of parallax also claimed that the spinning ball Earth theory perfectly explained all of the observable reality with a single unified model, then challenged me to point to a singular flat Earth model which similarly explains all aspects of observable reality too. Their position entails the claim that the ball Earth model works to explain all observations with a single unified theory, as well as the claim that the flat Earth model fails to explain observations of the moon. If I can first show evidence that the ball Earth model actually does not adequately explain certain natural observations, nor does the Earth realistically possess the necessary curvature or rotational motion demanded by the model, then do you think they will actually start to realize they're wrong? The answer is no. They will then jump to some other peripheral, unrelated, and long since debunked argument designed to try and avoid the initial primary problems mentioned, thus the vicious cycle continues. Instead of arguing or name-calling or debunking, how about this? Anyone who still believes in the ball Earth, do yourself a favor and set down the ball and any preconceived notions you might carry with you in regards to its hypersonic, orbital, and rotational motions, and just for argument's sake, skeptically revisit some of your longest held and dearest belief systems which were installed into your fundamental understanding of the world, the universe, and yourself during a time in your life when you were trusting, impressionable, innocent, honest with yourself, and unfortunately, very gullible, as we all were when we were very young. This is why they had to target us with the Ball Earth indoctrination and space porn propaganda when we were very, very young, during a phase in our lives when it was possible for our parents and the educational system to convince us all in the existence of Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy. They also snuck in the foundations of the globe Earth belief, as well as the pre-programmed belief that anyone who questions the Ball Earth or believes in flat Earth is instantly deemed anti-scientific, emotionally and mentally unstable, unintelligent, and prone to wild whims of conspiracy theory. Getting right on with it, the biggest problem with the moon is that, according to a heliocentric solar system model, the moon is often in absolutely the wrong place, visible overhead, when, according to the Ball Earth geometry layout, it should be far on the other side of the Ball Earth, beneath our feet, not overhead in the sky. So with that, we're going to wrap this one up, guys. I do appreciate you watching. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have found this video or our content helpful, please consider becoming a channel supporter through Patreon or PayPal. I'll put links in the description. Keyword is @TheMorgile here. Again, I wanted to thank our channel supporters and patrons. We do appreciate your help. Love you guys. And with that, we'll wrap this up. So everybody spread the word, spread the world, and peace out, you guys.